Howdy do, folks. Welcome to another CompTIA Network Plus lesson. In this lesson, we're going to explain IP version 4 networking, starting with what is an IP address. Now, first off, an IP address is a unique address that identifies a device on the internet or a local network. I suppose one might think of it as, well, your own name in a way. If I need to call you, I'm going to probably call you by your name, right? Every device on an internal network at home or the office has its own IP, and the same applies to any device going online. It's not just limited to desktop PCs and laptops as some might think. Other devices also work off IP addresses. These devices are devices like phones, tablets, printers, routers, access points, and the list goes on and on. Speaking of going on, if any of you folks would like to stay informed of when my lessons go live, remember to hit that subscribe button down below. Okay, getting back to the topic at hand, what does IP stand for? It stands for Internet Protocol. Now, I've said it before in some of my other videos, and I'll say it again. Knowing any and all abbreviations in a Network Plus course is extremely important if your intention is to go and write the CompTIA Network Plus exam. That's the N10-008 exam. Now, in the exam, they love asking questions using only the abbreviations of words. And if you're not familiar with those abbreviations, or what they stand for that matter, you're most likely going to find yourself in a sticky situation where you have no clue what the question is asking you. You might find it might be a very simple and easy question, but now just because you don't know what the abbreviation stands for, well, guess what? You're not going to be able to know what the question is all about. You're not going to be able to answer that question, and you're probably going to end up getting it wrong. Meanwhile, it was actually a pretty straightforward, easy question. Now, isn't that just going to suck? So familiarize yourself with those abbreviations. Part of my pronunciation. So if you find something that you don't know, write it down with the full meaning of it and what it actually is. If you find an abbreviation that you do know, let's say it's something simple like LAN, local area network. If you know what it stands for and you know what it is, ignore it. Skip it. If you find something you don't know, write it down with its full meaning, memorize it, and put that list somewhere that you can continuously see it. So put it behind the toilet door or somewhere you can see it every day. Memorize that list, and then when the time comes for you to go and write that exam, at least you'll know what everything is and what it stands for. Trust me, it's going to help you a lot. Now, once again, getting back to the main topic at hand here, in essence, IP addresses are the identifier that allows information to be sent between devices on a network. They contain local information and make devices accessible for communication. The internet needs a way to differentiate between different computers, routers, and websites. IP addresses provide a way of doing so and form an essential part of how the internet actually works. Alrighty, and then for the folks who are curious what an IP address looks like and how you configure it, let's first show you what this looks like. An example of an IP address would look something like this: 192.168.1.15. Now that is an IP address, folks. In most small networks like your home, you'd find that IP usually starts with 192.168. Now that's not set in stone, obviously, but it is an indication of what size network you have. And in this case, it would tell us that you most likely have a Class C network and that your IP is a private IP address. Now, don't stress just yet about what a private IP address is and what a Class C network is, because you might be freaking out when you hear those terms if you're not familiar with those. Those topics are still coming up in the next few videos after this one. And in those videos, I'm going to explain those topics in great detail for you guys. So hold on to your underwear for those lessons, folks. Now, when you or someone decides to configure an IP address, you'll also have to configure something called the subnet mask. This, in most small networks, will look something like 255.255.255.0. And that's pretty much the most common and most simple kind of subnet mask you'll get. It's obviously not limited to that. This is just to give you guys an idea of what it more or less would look like. More on that topic later. So this basically tells us what size network you have. That's not a subnet mask. It tells us how many times it's been subdivided. It tells us how many IP addresses you have inside of that network. And it also tells us how many networks you have amongst other things. The things I just mentioned aren't the only things the subnet mask tells us, but those are some of the most common things you need to know and some of the most common things you'll most likely end up working with from a day-to-day base. Okay, and then besides configuring the subnet mask, you will also need to configure something called the default gateway. I wouldn't say it's compulsory for someone to configure this though. It depends. Some folks might lead you to believe that this part is compulsory, and in fact, it is not. It all depends on whether you or your client or your customer needs to send digital traffic outside their network. Do they or do they not need to do that? Now, what I mean by that is, do you, for example, want devices inside your home or inside your office to be able to communicate with the outside world? This could be the internet in most cases. If anyone on any device wants to go onto the internet, that is digital traffic that's going to be leaving your network. If traffic needs to leave your network, you need to point that traffic to the device that it needs to go through to get to the outside world. That device, in case you haven't guessed it yet, is in most cases going to be, drum roll, your router. Now, the router is the device that traffic needs to flow through to get to the outside world. It's the same device traffic from the outside needs to flow through to get to the inside part of your network. Potato, potato. Kind of makes sense now, doesn't it? Now, in a real world scenario, in an actual company, you will, for example, have something like a firewall there in between. There's going to be a physical firewall involved and all kinds of other nonsense. Not something you folks need to worry about at this point in time. All of that is stuff I'm going to cover with you guys as an extra in some of the other videos that's going to follow this one. So don't worry about it at this point in time. All you need to know at this point in time is for you or your client or your customer's traffic to be able to get to the outside world, like the internet, you need to provide the router's destination. So with all of that said, the default gateway is the device the traffic needs to flow through to get to the outside. So in other words, the default gateway is the IP address of your router in most cases, like you would have guessed by now. The router IP you'll find almost always ends with .1. We normally configure it like this on purpose, and this is usually seen as best practice. So when the next guy gets there, it's just going to be easier to figure out what the router's IP is because it's probably going to be .1. So if my own IP address in this example is 192.168.1, and you can see my IP ends with .15, can you guess what the router's IP is going to be? It's going to be exactly the same, except the last character is not going to be .15, it's going to be .1. Okay, and then lastly, we have something called the preferred DNS. This is the IP address of the DNS you or your client or your customer wishes to use. Well, nowadays, I don't really see companies using much internal DNS servers. I suppose you still get them, but not as much as you used to. Nowadays, I've seen most companies will go and use public DNS servers like Google, believe it or not. Now, the IP address for Google's DNS server is 8.8.8.8. Nope, I'm not kidding. That actually is the IP address for Google's DNS. So if you find yourself or anyone else for that matter having that IP in the DNS section, that means they're using a public DNS server, more specifically Google. Now Google has a second IP address there, which is 8.8.4.4. Yep, that's it. So yeah, those are very easy to remember, as you guys can see. I mean, it's almost impossible to forget those IPs. Alright, so now that we've got all of this nonsense out of the way, I think what's left for me to do here is to show you guys how you actually go and configure an IP address, a subnet mask, a default gateway, and a DNS IP address on a normal client PC. Now the way I'm about to show you guys is exactly the same for a server for the most part, assuming there's no DHCP server involved. Also a topic for later if you don't know what that is. Alright, so let's switch over to a computer.
A few moments later.
Okay, folks, here we are on a Windows 10 machine. Now, I just want to point out I'm only going to show you guys how to do this on Windows 10 and not Windows 11. And if you're wondering why, well, the CompTIA Network Plus course, being the N10-008 course, was released on September 2021. And Windows 11 was released in October 2021, about roughly a month after the course was released. So it goes without saying that Windows 11 is not in this course, and in the exam you will not be asked about Windows 11 content. So if anyone was wondering whether they need to go and study something regarding Windows 11, no, you do not need to do that because the course came out before Windows 11 was released. So it just makes sense that there's going to be no Windows 11 content in the course. Now that does not obviously apply to the new N Plus course that's going to come out after the N10-008. So the one that's going to come out after this one's obviously going to include Windows 11, but it's not something you guys need to worry about anytime soon, since there's about another 3 years left before that course will get released. Alright, so now we are on Windows 11, and if you would like to go and configure your IP addresses, the most common place to go and do so is to go into your Network and Sharing Center. Now, how you get there depends on the build of Windows 10 you have. Now, the build I have on this machine is a very old build, so if I go to the bottom right here to my little computer icon, and if I right click there, you'll see it says Open Network and Sharing Center. Now on the newer builds of Windows 10, that is not what you guys will see. You will see Open Internet and something something. So let me show you guys what it looks like on a newer build. So just one moment.
A few moments later.
And here we are on Windows 10 again, but this is a newer build of Windows 10. So on this machine, if I were to go and right click on the little computer icon, notice it does not say Open Network and Sharing Center. Instead, it says Open Network and Internet Settings. So that is going to go and open your Settings app, which is effectively the new control panel that's going to replace the old one. So if I click on that, just to show you what it looks like, that's what it looks like. And on this menu, you're basically just going to go and look for Network and Sharing Center, which you can see right here. Now, it's not necessarily going to go and look like that. There's been cases on some builds where it might be like a little hyperlink, something like these ones here. So it might be a hyperlink, it might be a button, it might be something entirely different. It depends on how Microsoft feels on that particular day whenever they release the last update. So every time Microsoft decides to go and release a new update, they think it's funny to keep moving stuff around. At least that's how I perceive it. I get the impression there's folks sitting at Microsoft around a table and they're probably thinking to themselves, hey guys, we haven't changed anything this month yet. Let's just go and move some random components around just to see if people notice. So that's probably not what they do, but I kind of get the feeling that's what they do. You know, it feels like that sometimes. If you were to go and click on that one there, Network and Sharing Center, that is where you're going to go and configure your IP addresses, more specifically there. So switching back to the previous machine.
3 weeks later.
Alright, here we are back on the previous machine. Here at the bottom right, you would simply just click on that icon there. It says Open Network and Sharing Center. It goes about saying that these are not the only ways you can go and get to that destination. You can alternatively go to Cortana here, or you can go to start a search for it. I mean, there's probably like a million ways you can get there. So right clicking there, Open Network and Sharing Center, there we are again. Now if you don't see anything here, that could possibly mean you've got no network card installed, the network card possibly turned off, or there's no Ethernet cable plugged in, or you are not connected to a Wi-Fi hotspot. If it's a hotspot, you'll see the icon shows a little bit different, so that icon shows us it is an Ethernet cable. I'm going to go click on that icon there, little blue hyperlink that says Ethernet. Once you get here, you're going to want to go to where it says Properties. Once you get here, you are going to want to go click where it says IP version 4, which is the topic for today. Now, I do want to point out you also get IP version 6, which came out towards the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, on Windows Vista or Vista, depending on how you want to pronounce that. So that's more or less when that came out. And the reason for that is because we're currently running out of IP addresses on version 4, and version 6 is obviously way more secure, and there's a lot more I can say about it, but that's a topic for a different video because this video is about IP version 4. So getting back to the topic of IP version 4, once you've selected it like I just did, you're going to want to go and click on Properties. And when you get here, what it's going to look like by default is something like that and something like that. Now that is the default on the average server. That is the default on the average client computer. So when it's on that option that says obtain an IP address automatically, that is called dynamic. So as soon as you plug a network cable into this machine, or as soon as you connect it to a hotspot, like a Wi-Fi connection of some kind, this machine is going to request an IP address. It doesn't currently have one. So as soon as you connect it to a network, your machine is going to basically ask for an IP address on the network. It's going to go and look for a DHCP server. For those of you that know what that is, that's a topic for later. It's going to look for a DHCP server. It's going to say, hello, is there a DHCP server out there? If there is one, the DHCP server will reply and say, hello, yes, I'm here. How can I help you? Your machine is going to say, I'm here. I need an IP address. The server is going to offer it one. Your PC is going to probably accept it. And then the server is going to dish out that IP address to your machine. Now, it's worth noting that these IPs do tend to expire. They have a lease period on them. But that's a topic once more for that video once we start discussing DHCP. Now the second option here, this is seen as a static IP address. It's known as static. It's also known as fixed IP address. So whatever IP address you, the user, or a fellow technician goes and fills in here, that is going to stay like that permanently until you or someone comes in here one day and goes and changes it. So you can see here, obviously the first block here says IP address. I'm going to go and fill in that same IP we had earlier, 192.168.115. Now, if you're joining this machine to a network that already has some existing machines, you cannot necessarily go and willy-nilly go and fill in any IP address here. You will need to go and check what the IP range is on that network. Once more, a topic for later. So I just want to mention that you are going to have to go and check what range those machines are on. And based on that, you will go and make a decision on what needs to be filled in here. There is where you will go and fill in your subnet mask, which we spoke of earlier. The subnet mask is going to really tell you a lot of what you need to know. So the 3255s here tells us we're dealing with a class C network. If you saw 255, 255, and this last digit was something else other than 255, that would be considered a class B network. If you only saw 1255 from the front and these other 3 octets were something else other than 255, that will be considered a class A network. Now, a class C network, a full class C network, has about 256 IP addresses, of which 254 are usable. Not something you need to know yet. That is a topic for a different video. Now, if you've got a class B network, that's a much bigger network. That's got about approximately 16,000 odd IP addresses. A little bit more than 16,000. If you've got a class A, that's about approximately 16 million IP addresses. That's a lot. And even so, we are still running out of IP addresses. Now, with regards to the default gateway, you would remember that is the IP address of a device I'm going to have to go through to get to the outside world, like the internet. Now, I don't have to fill that in if I intend on only connecting locally inside my house, so only inside my office building, and never actually leaving my network. You can leave it like that and everything will work just fine. But if you want to go and use the internet or whatever else, you're going to have to fill in the IP address of your default gateway, which is your router. Now, at the moment, I can see my IP is going to be 192.168.1.something, 15 in this case. So my router is probably going to be 192.168.1.what? Now, that's not set in stone. It's just normally as best practice. Most technicians, including myself, will go and make the router's IP address .1 at the end. This could possibly be something else. I mean, it could even possibly be the company's physical firewall. DNS. So the DNS server, just in a nutshell, is the server that's going to go and convert IPs to names and names to IPs, amongst other things. There's many, many things it actually does. So if your PC has to go onto the internet, and let's say it does go onto the internet, and you want to go to a certain website, let's say like YouTube. So you're going to go and type in www.youtube.com, but your computer does not know where that is. So it's going to go and contact the DNS server, which you can think of as a Yellow Pages. It's like an online digital GPS, in a manner of speaking. So the DNS server is going to go and tell your computer what the IP address of youtube.com is, and it's going to guide it there. Now, DNS server, what the heck is the IP address for that? Well, that depends on whether it's an internal one or an external one. If it's a public one, like Google, it's probably going to be 8888. And then if you want, you can go and type in 8844 if you really want to. Not compulsory, but that does work. So this PC has actually been set up now to be able to go and use the internet. So all I need to go and do now is click on OK. Alright folks, so that is what an IP address is, more or less what a subnet mask is, more or less what a default gateway is, and more or less what a DNS is. So I want to point out that there's going to be a dedicated video specifically for IP addresses that's going to explain what a private IP address is, what a public IP address is. And then in that video, we're also going to explain the different kinds of private IP addresses you get, such as Class C, Class B, and Class A. And there's also going to be a video for subnetting. We're going to show you guys how to go and do some basic subnetting. You do need to know that for the exam. We're going to go and do a video on default gateways. How do we go and configure that? And where do we go and configure that? There's going to be a video for DHCP. That's a server. Now, in an actual company environment, that's going to be an actual server with a role installed. If it's like a small office, home office environment, or your household, it's most likely going to be your router that's going to act as if it's a DHCP. So I think just for good measure, I'll show you guys both of those. I'll explain both of those, and I'll give you practical examples of both of those. DNS server, that's also going to be a whole video on its own. We'll explain what DNS is and how it actually works. Alright folks, if you feel like you've learned something, please show me that you have by giving the video a like. If you'd like to know when the next lessons comes out, like those ones I've just mentioned, remember to hit that subscribe button down below. And like usual, I just want to give a special thank you and shout out to the Patreon sponsors of this channel. If you guys would like to sponsor this channel as well, you can find all of that information in the video description down below. Alright folks, stay frosty. I will see you on the next lesson.